Rocksteady recently unveiled, the exact day I finished playing this game for this video in fact, that their latest project after 5 years is a Suicide Squad game. So in the spirit of that and the upcoming DC fandom event, let's continue my look at the Arkham games with what could be considered the black sheep of the series, and yes, I have the Wii U version. I say black sheep because it's the only main entry thus far not to be developed by Rocksteady. They were preoccupied with what we now know to be Arkham Knights, so to tide us over, little-known company Warner Bros. Montreal took the helm for this prequel. But following up what me and many others would consider to be one of the pinnacles of video game entertainment is no small feat, and unsurprisingly, reactions at the time were mixed. Not that I care about the majority's opinion, this is about what I think, so what do I think of Origins? Well, like I briefly mentioned, this is a prequel taking place several years before Asylum. But it's not really a Batman origin story. Don't expect it to start with the Wayne's murder, it's 2 years into his crime-fighting career. Rather, it's the beginning of key relationships and him becoming a known figure among Gothamites. It's Christmas Eve, and a breakout at Blackgate Prison sets off the night in dramatic style as Batman eventually discovers that Black Mask has put a $50 million bounty on his head, with 8 assassins hoping to claim the prize. So the Caped Crusader sets out to take down the assassins, all while avoiding the GCPD, who are yet to trust him properly. A good premise for the first half of the story, and then it becomes Batman versus the Joker and Bane. To be honest, I think the whole bounty setup is strong enough that that could have been the entire plot, and having 2 of the 8 assassins be side missions does take away potential tension, but the more cinematic storytelling does lend itself a confidence that's pretty engaging from the offset, leading to some very memorable scenes and an overall pretty good story. It's always interesting to see these characters in the earlier stages of discovering who they are, and we get some interesting contrasts to what we know they become in Rocksteady's titles. Everyone's more energetic, from a more prominent Alfred who disapproves of Batman's crusade somewhat. However, his continued support regardless is as enjoyable as always, even if he gets an outburst that comes a bit out of left field. Also, and this is kind of a spoiler, but it's a bit pointless that they make it seem that Bane kills Alfred, seeing as we know he doesn't die. But it's Batman's reaction that gives that moment some emotional heft. Speaking of Bane, he has a much larger role than in the first 2 games, and is less akin to the bulky brute in Batman and Robin, but rather the brutal and clever calculator of The Dark Knight Rises. He's both interesting and memorable. Then there's Batman and the Joker, both of whom have new voice actors behind them. But as someone who considers Kevin Conroy and Mark Hamill to be the definitive versions of these characters, replacing them isn't an easy task for the developers. For The Dark Knight, we have Sonic the Hedgehog himself, Roger Craig Smith, taking the helm, and he doesn't do a bad job. Batman at this time isn't as in complete control of his emotions yet, so you get a more rage-driven and overly aggressive version of the character, which is pretty cool to see. We also have a more rambunctious Joker, with Troy Baker stepping into Hamill's shoes quite nicely. People were a little disappointed that he was the main villain yet again, but he is often the centerpiece of the game's most memorable scenes, and getting to witness firsthand the toll his actions are having on Batman with their relationship unestablished is rather fascinating stuff. Beyond that, the rest of the characters are fine. The assassins have little to them outside of being boss battles, and everyone else has too brief an appearance to leave any impression. So in some ways, yeah, the story does lack. But I think the presentation manages to elevate things enough by way of the performances and the music to create for some really good moments that ultimately make the story worthwhile. It does feel like Warner Bros. Montreal brought their own unique flair to the series as storytellers. But when it comes to them as game designers, they're clearly under Rocksteady's influence. But to be fair, if you were given mechanics as deliriously exhilarating as the Arkham games, you'd be cautious to tinker with them. And this does play almost identical to City, right down to the grapple boost that was in the prototype stage in that game. Yeah, I know video game prequels have to take some gameplay liberties, it's just kind of funny to me. Anyway, the point is that outside of a couple of new gadgets and enemy types that appear briefly, there's very little here from a gameplay standpoint that makes this game stand out from the others. The biggest innovation was a now deceased multiplayer mode that was actually pretty fun, where playing as a thug was a unique dynamic in comparison to just playing as Batman or Robin. I really liked it, and it's a shame that the servers shut down. I actually got that footage way back in late 2016 before it became unplayable, just in case I ever decided to review the Arkham series. So 4 years later, there's my piece on that. But getting back to the main game, it still manages to be good fun despite the similarities to City. Not nearly as much though, for reasons that don't have anything to do with the mechanics. There's two problems, the first being the over-reliance of fistfights. One of the things that made the first two games so great was how you were constantly flipping between the hand-to-hand combat and the Predator stuff, meaning that a sense of repetition never set in. Meanwhile, Origins is about 70% hands-on conflict, which as engrossing as the controls are, it's still so satisfying to get a large combo, does begin to get a little tedious after a while. Sure, there's traversal sections to break things up, but more often than not, it boils down to using new gadget the remote claw or the cryptographic sequencer, which is weirdly overabundant. It still makes for a fun game, but compared to the other two, it's just not as gripping. Same goes for the Predator mode when you actually get to those parts. The maps are substantially larger than before. Everything is spacious enough for it to become a game of mostly inverted and silent takedowns, losing some of that sense of invention the other two games had. I feel like I'm coming off harsher than I actually do feel. The blueprints of Rocksteady's excellent gameplay is still there, it just lacks that same sense of balance that those games nailed. Warner Bros. Montreal's game also lacks a much less compelling world that you'll be traipsing around. It's set in a subsection of Gotham this time, with one half of the map Montreal's creation, and on the other side of a very long bridge is what is to become Arkham City, only with the personality drained out of it. This game lacks the enveloping atmosphere. The Christmas vibe does work well, particularly in the great soundtrack, but the open world is very bland, with little in the way of interesting and memorable locations, especially the interiors. The comic book edge isn't as prominent, and so some of these maps feel like they could be from any old game. The bland vistas also meant that on this second playthrough, I didn't feel that compelled to revisit these side quests as thoroughly. Not that there aren't good ones, Mad Hatter's is pretty memorable, but they're either rehashes from Arkham City or just not that interesting. The Riddler, or should I say Enigma, challenges just aren't as interesting without any of the actual riddles to solve. I did spend some time playing the side missions when I first played this a few years ago, but I didn't fancy going out of my way to revisit them this go around. So in many ways, I guess Origins could be considered a disappointment, little more than a lesser redo of its predecessors. But there are some things that it nails that irons out its shortcomings quite nicely. The world's greatest detective can finally do some more thorough mystery solving with crime scenes where you gradually piece together what has unfolded. All you really have to do is find these red arrows, but it is satisfying to gradually uncover what has happened, and it's good fun. And regardless of how you feel about this game, most people can agree that the boss fights are among some of the best in the series, easily Origins' biggest asset. The Killer Croc one is pretty good, but from there, the Deathstroke duel is a classic, simple yet invigoratingly visceral. Copperhead is decently overwhelming, Bane gets some great encounters, Electrocutioner is an epic struggle of patient endurance, Firefly's a lot of fun, they're really damn memorable. So as a complete whole, Arkham Origins doesn't hold up as well as I remember, but there is plenty to enjoy here. At times it serves as a good lesson that basic mechanics can't entirely carry a game, and maybe it does struggle under the shadow of the two incredible titles that preceded it, but Warner Bros. Montreal also creates moments that feel entirely their own, so I'm looking forward to seeing what they've been conjuring up for the Cape Crusader with their latest project. Hopefully they've grown in confidence to embrace their own style a little more. But this is still a solid outing for The Dark Knight, and for what was merely keeping fans occupied before the next game by Rocksteady, it did a good job of filling that gap. And as for what did follow, well, that's for another day. In the meantime, this has its shortcomings, but I do like it. Oh yeah, and I don't know if it's just the Wii U version, but it's not the most polished game out there.